Alberta is not losing its oil. It is losing the promise that oil was supposed to keep. The wells are still running, the bitumen is still moving, and the wealth is still leaving. It just stopped coming back. In 2014, Alberta's oil sands employed roughly 143,000 people directly and indirectly in extraction and related services. Today, oil sands production volumes are near all-time highs. The province is pumping more oil than it ever has, and oil and gas employment sits roughly 25 to 30% below that peak. More oil, fewer people. That is not a recovery story waiting to resolve itself on the next price cycle. That is a structural shift quietly embedded inside what looks from a distance like success. The royalties still flow. Calgary still has glass towers. Fort McMurray still operates. And yet, something is gone from the machine. Might not the engine, the distribution mechanism, the part that turned a barrel of bitumen into a mortgage, a tradesperson's wage, an engineering career, a small business in Red Deer, a pension contribution in Lethbridge. The extraction continues. The renewal has quietly stopped. This is the story of how that happened without a single dramatic collapse, without a policy villain, without a moment you could point to and say, that is when it broke. Because it did not break. It evolved. Rational decision by rational decision, each one defensible in isolation, collectively rerouting the wealth flowing out of the ground away from the people living above it. The system still works. It just works for different people now. To understand what changed, you have to understand what was actually built between 2000 and 2014. Gone because it was not simply an oil industry, it was a social contract with a geological foundation. Alberta's model had a beautiful, almost mechanical simplicity. Global capital would flow into the province as investment in new oil sands megaprojects. Those projects would require enormous quantities of labor, materials, and services. Wages would be high because the work was remote, technically demanding, and physically brutal, and the product being extracted was worth enough to justify paying people well. Those wages would circulate through housing, retail, professional services, and construction. Government would collect royalties on production and income taxes on wages. Some revenue would stay in Alberta. Some would flow federally through equalization. The whole country would benefit. That is not an idealized description. That is approximately what happened. A millwright from Saskatchewan could drive to Fort McMurray, work a fly-in, fly-out rotation, and earn more in 3 years than his parents earned in a decade. A civil engineer graduating from the University of Alberta in 2007 had multiple six-figure offers before she picked up her diploma. A tradesperson who had never left Red Deer found his skills suddenly worth more than he had dared to plan for. The boom did not just create wealth at the top, it created a compression of opportunity that reached into working-class households in a way that most economies do not manage even in their best years. The incentive structure aligned perfectly. More capital meant more projects meant more workers meant higher wages. Higher wages expanded the local economy. A larger local economy attracted more capital. The cycle fed itself. What made this feel permanent was that it was backed by something real. Alberta holds approximately 165 billion barrels of proven recoverable reserves, one of the largest accumulations of recoverable hydrocarbon on Earth. The oil was there, under the muskeg, priced into markets that had spent years establishing $90 to $100 per barrel, not as a ceiling, but as a new floor. The expectation felt rational, because for a window of time, it was. Consider what a downtown Calgary office tower looked like in 2012. The leasing market was so tight that companies were signing 15-year commitments just to secure space. Engineering firms, oil company headquarters, legal practices, financial services, all expanding simultaneously. Vacancy rates in Class A towers were below 4%. Companies were taking floors they did not immediately need because they expected to grow into them within 18 months. That is a logical response to a genuine demand signal in an economy firing on every cylinder simultaneously. The problem was not that people believed the boom was real. It was real. The problem was that both the public and private sectors made durable commitments, Long-term leases, permanent hires, infrastructure bonds, provincial spending baselines, calibrated to peak conditions, not normalized conditions. When the cycle turned, those commitments did not turn with it. The 2014 oil price crash is often described as the moment Alberta's modern troubles began. That framing is partially correct and partially misleading. The crash was real. West Texas Intermediate fell from over $100 per barrel in mid-2014 to below $30 in early 2016. Western Canadian Select, the benchmark for Alberta's bitumen-blended crude, fell even further. Projects that penciled out at $80 per barrel looked catastrophic at $35. But the crash did not simply reduce revenue. It changed behavior in ways that outlasted the prices. Before 2014, the dominant logic among publicly traded energy companies was growth. Grow production, grow reserves, grow market share. The financial markets rewarded companies that expanded aggressively. The implicit assumption was that high prices were structural and that companies capturing the most production early would benefit most as prices continued rising. That logic died in 2014, not temporarily. Structurally, the crash exposed something the previous decade had masked. Oil sands projects are among the most capital-intensive, longest payback period assets in the global energy industry. A new oil sands mine requires billions in upfront capital, years of construction, and a decade or more to fully recover the initial investment. At $100 per barrel, those economics are forgiving. At $50 with ongoing volatility, they are terrifying. Global capital looked at those economics and made a clear, rational decision. We are not doing this again. Capital expenditure in Canadian oil and gas dropped roughly 40% between 2014 and 2016. Projects under construction were completed, projects in planning were shelved. When prices partially recovered, the response was cautious. The financial markets had made their expectations clear. Dividends and debt reduction, not reinvestment. Production recovered and eventually grew, but the investment multiplier that had created the boom, billions in new project spending generating years of employment in construction, fabrication, and support services, did not return. A drilling engineer in Calgary who had spent 12 years in project development found himself in 2016 not temporarily displaced, but structurally redundant. The projects his skills were built for were no longer being built. His expertise had declining value in Alberta and growing value in Texas, where shale development was accelerating. He moved to Houston in 2017. He has not come back. Here is a number worth holding. Capital investment in Canada's oil and gas sector peaked at roughly $81 billion in 2014. By recent years, it has recovered to somewhere in the mid-$40 billion range. That gap is not a rounding error. That gap is the difference between an economy that builds things and an economy that operates things. Construction employment, engineering, fabrication, project management, all of these scale with investment, not with production. When a mature project extracts oil at steady state, it employs a fraction of the people it required during construction. Alberta's oil sands are increasingly mature projects operating at steady state. The construction is finished. Layered on top of capital discipline was a geographic problem that compounded the damage in ways still not fully appreciated outside the industry. Alberta's crude is landlocked. Pipelines are the only economic way to move bitumen-blended crude at scale. And Alberta's pipeline network, for most of the period following the crash, did not provide sufficient access to tidewater or to the range of refineries that could handle heavy oil. This created a structural discount. Western Canadian Select crude traded at a persistent differential below West Texas Intermediate. In late 2018, that differential briefly reached $50 per barrel. While U.S. benchmark crude sold at roughly $60, Alberta producers received approximately $10. At $10 per barrel, you are not covering operating costs on many oil sands operations, let alone generating returns on invested capital. The cumulative revenue loss to Alberta from pipeline constraints since 2010 has been estimated at tens of billions of dollars. We are not talking about a marginal inefficiency. Today, we are talking about a structural tax on Alberta's resource wealth imposed not by policy but by geography and infrastructure deficit. Trans Mountain was completed after decades of delay at a ballooned cost of over $30 billion. Keystone XL was canceled. Energy East never made it through the regulatory process. The companies learned the lesson. The lesson was not fight harder for pipelines. The lesson was deploy capital somewhere else. Automation deserves specific attention because it is consistently under-discussed in the public narrative about Alberta's employment challenge. The oil sands are not a pick-and-shovel operation. They are among the most technologically sophisticated industrial facilities on Earth. And technology does not stand still in capital-intensive industries. Over the past decade, operators have invested heavily in automation, remote operations, and predictive analytics that reduce the number of humans required per barrel extracted. Autonomous haul trucks now operate at multiple oil sands mines. Vehicles the size of houses that once required human operators working 12-hour shifts now operate 24 hours a day without rest, without shift changes, without the costs associated with human fatigue. A mine that might have employed 100 truck operators now employs fewer than 10 people to oversee an entire autonomous fleet. None of this is malicious. All of it is rational. Companies that automate reduce their per-barrel operating cost, which makes them more competitive at low prices and more profitable at high prices. The economic outcome is that production per worker rises while employment per unit of production falls. The industry calls this productivity improvement. From a narrow financial perspective, it is. From the perspective of a worker who expected to participate in the province's resource wealth through employment, it is something different. A barrel of oil extracted with autonomous trucks generates the same royalty to the government and the same dividend to the shareholder as a barrel extracted with the full workforce of a decade ago. But it does not generate the same wage in Fort McMurray, the same grocery purchase, the same mortgage payment, the same demand for housing or childcare or retail. The extraction continues. The circulation does not. As energy expansion slowed, Alberta leaned more heavily on population growth and housing to sustain GDP. Migration continued. Construction activity absorbed displaced labor. Politicians could point to cranes and immigration inflows and describe an economy that was adapting. But housing is not an export industry. When a new condominium is built in Calgary, it generates GDP during construction, but it does not sell to a buyer in Seoul or Houston. The debt it creates is carried by the household that purchased it. Oil, by contrast, brings foreign currency into the country. It earns dollars from buyers who are not Canadian. It expands the national balance sheet in a way that domestic economic activity cannot replicate. The substitution of housing-driven internal debt expansion for energy-driven external revenue is not a like-for-like trade. It is a downgrade dressed as diversification, and the people carrying the mortgages are not the same people who benefited from the royalties. Consider a dual-income household in southwest Calgary. Both partners work, one in financial services, one in project management for an engineering firm. They purchased a home in 2019, their mortgage renewed at a higher rate. The monthly payment increased by several $100s. Neither works in oil and gas directly, but both employers depend partly on oil sector activity. The engineering firm has fewer clients than it did in 2015. The financial services firm has seen slower commercial lending growth. Neither income feels insecure exactly, but neither has grown the way their parents' incomes grew at comparable career stages. They are doing everything right. 2 careers, a home, financial responsibility. And the math feels somehow like running in place. The province around them is producing record oil volumes. The royalties are flowing. And the wage acceleration, the sense that hard work in Alberta compounds into something substantial, that feeling is quieter than it used to be. They are not wrong about that feeling. The concept of yield asset versus growth asset is the cleanest description of what has changed, and it is almost never used in public conversation about Alberta. A growth asset is one in which capital is continually reinvested into expansion. New capacity is built. Employment grows. The local economy expands in proportion to investment activity. Growth assets generate dynamism. They create opportunities that did not previously exist. They justify migration. They justify career bets. They justify building a city around their activity. A yield asset is one in which existing capacity generates cash flow distributed to shareholders rather than reinvested into new capacity. The asset operates, it maintains, it optimizes, but it does not expand at rates that meaningfully grow employment or create new economic activity at scale. Alberta's oil sands have been transitioning from growth asset to yield asset since approximately 2014. This transition benefits shareholders of publicly traded energy companies who receive dividends and buybacks. It benefits pension funds that hold energy equities as stable, yield-generating components of diversified portfolios. It benefits global institutional investors who want commodity exposure without development risk. It does not benefit workers whose employment was tied to expansion activity. It does not benefit municipal governments that depend on a dense, employed population to fund services. It does not benefit young people who came to Alberta expecting an expanding industrial economy to absorb their skills. The distribution of benefit and risk is not random, it is structural. Those with capital assets benefit from capital discipline. Those with only labor assets absorb the cost. The North Sea comparison carries demographic implications that have not fully arrived in Alberta yet, but are already visible on the horizon. The United Kingdom's North Sea oil revenues funded Margaret Thatcher's government through deindustrialization, softening the political consequences of manufacturing collapse. When production plateaued and declined, the underlying hollowing became visible. The industries that might have replaced energy were not sufficiently developed. The result was growing regional inequality still politically live 30 years later. Alberta's production is not declining, but the employment and investment intensity of the sector is declining relative to what it was during expansion, and the province has not built a credible replacement for the industrial multiplier that energy expansion once provided. The demographic signal is already measurable. Young, skilled workers increasingly evaluate opportunities in the United States. Calgary's technology sector has made genuine efforts to diversify. There are real successes, but a technology startup that employs 200 engineers does not move the needle on an economy that lost tens of thousands of direct and indirect energy jobs since 2014. Here is the math of replacement that rarely gets articulated clearly. A single major oil sands megaproject in construction directly and indirectly employs somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000 people across engineering, project management, heavy equipment operation, electrical work, pipe fitting, and logistics. To replace that with technology sector employment, you would need to create hundreds of companies with average employment of 50 to 100 people each. The timeline to build that capacity from scratch is measured in decades. Alberta has not had decades. It has had 10 years of partial attempts. Consider a newly qualified petroleum engineer graduating from the University of Calgary in 2023. She spent 5 years learning reservoir modeling, production optimization, well completion design. She graduates into an industry running at near-record operational levels. Production is high, prices have been reasonably supportive, but the job market is not the one described to her when she started the program. Energy firms in Calgary are not hiring at prior rates. They are maintaining lean organizations, replacing people who retire or leave, not staffing new development programs. The interesting technical work is increasingly happening in the United States, where shale development continues, or in international operations that require relocation. She has 3 offers, 1 in Calgary, 2 in Houston, one of which is denominated in US dollars at a salary 40% higher in nominal terms, which adjusts to something larger still given the Canadian dollar's persistent discount. She is making the decision that thousands of young, skilled Albertans are making in various forms, not under duress, not dramatically, quietly, with spreadsheets and pragmatism. She moves to Houston in the summer. Alberta has been having a conversation about diversification with itself for approximately 30 years. Through every boom and every bust, through every political cycle, the conclusion has been the same. The province needs a more diversified economic base, less dependent on commodity cycles. The conversation is genuine. The diagnosis is correct. The implementation has been inadequate. not because Albertans are not capable. They are. But because diversification at the required scale is a multi-decade, multi-government, multi-billion-dollar project that requires sustained commitment across political cycles. And every time commodity prices recover, the political urgency around diversification diminishes. The boom absorbs the anxiety. The lesson learned is that the cycle always reverses, so perhaps the push can wait another year, except each recovery is a little less employment-intensive than the last. Each recovery distributes benefit a little less broadly. Each year of delay is a year in which talent, capital, and institutional momentum potentially leave. The optionality of building something new compounds in reverse. Alberta's net debt, which was essentially zero through most of the 2000s and early 2000s, has grown significantly since 2014. Various estimates place the province's net financial position in ranges of several billion to over $50 billion, depending on how contingent liabilities and pension obligations are counted. For a province of approximately 4.7 million people, that represents a meaningful constraint on fiscal flexibility. Not a crisis, but not the debt-free province that could invest aggressively in economic transformation, fund a sovereign wealth fund from royalties, and maintain public services without a provincial sales tax. The Heritage Savings Trust Fund was created in 1976 with the explicit intention of saving a portion of oil revenues for future generations. It reached approximately $12 billion by the early 1980s. It then stagnated for decades as governments chose current spending over the endowment. Norway, with a similar original intention, built its sovereign wealth fund to over $1 trillion. Alberta's Heritage Fund sits at roughly $20 billion. The counterfactual is uncomfortable. Consistent? Disciplined saving during boom years would have produced a financial buffer capable of funding diversification, stabilizing public services during downturns, and reducing the dependence on current oil prices for current spending. That buffer does not exist at the required scale because the political incentive to spend revenues in the present always overwhelmed the institutional commitment to save them for the future. This is not a character failure of specific politicians. It is the predictable output of a political incentive structure operating exactly as designed. Time, deployed this way, is not a policy tool. It is a debt instrument. What does downtown Calgary look like now? In 2014, Class A office vacancy was below 4%. By 2020, it had reached approximately 33%, the highest of any major Canadian city. Billions of dollars of office space sat empty or underutilized. Energy firms that had locked in long leases during the boom were subleasing floors they no longer needed. The city developed programs to convert empty towers into residential units. The logic is sound. The results have been mixed. Conversion is expensive, technically complex, and not always economically viable without significant subsidy. But step back from the conversion programs and ask what the vacancy itself represents. It represents the physical residue of investment decisions made during a boom that assumed its own continuation. Those towers were built for a version of Calgary's economy that reached a peak and contracted. The steel and glass are still there. The companies and workers who would have filled them are not, at least not at the density required to justify the space. A city whose commercial core is 25 to 30% vacant is a city physically organized around an economic model that no longer fully exists. Canada's national economic model, for approximately 2 decades, implicitly depended on Alberta as a balancing mechanism. When central Canadian manufacturing struggled with a high dollar driven partly by oil prices, federal revenues from the energy sector allowed support for affected regions. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, Canada's banks were relatively resilient, partly because their energy sector loan books were intact. The assumption that Alberta would always regenerate and always serve as fiscal backstop became embedded in national planning in ways that were not fully explicit, but were operationally real. Yet, if Alberta's role as national growth engine is permanently reduced, not collapsed, but operating at lower intensity with weaker employment multipliers, the federal government faces a structural revenue problem it has not yet fully acknowledged. The Canadian economy needs a replacement for what Alberta's oil expansion once provided. Large-scale, export-oriented industrial activity that generates foreign currency inflows, creates middle-class employment at scale, and produces government revenue sufficient to fund a social contract across a geographically dispersed country. There is no obvious replacement. Technology is growing, but not at the required scale. Real estate and construction generate domestic activity, but no foreign revenue. Green energy is the policy aspiration, but the timescale for it to generate comparable economic activity is longer than most planning horizons acknowledge. Canada is, quietly and without most of its citizens fully realizing it, beginning to reckon with what happens when its principal economic stabilizer no longer generates the dynamism it once did. Alberta is not failing. The oil sands will continue producing for decades. The royalties will continue flowing, subject to price cycles. The population will continue growing through immigration. The GDP will continue reporting in numbers that look respectable, but the economy that grows from here will be a different economy from the one that existed between 2000 and 2014. It will extract enormous resource value, but distribute less of that value through employment. It will generate dividends for global pension funds and institutional investors, but fewer middle-class wages for residents of Wood Buffalo or Peace Country or the suburbs of Calgary. It will maintain fiscal stability through conservative budgeting, but will not generate the surplus required to fund dramatic structural reinvention. The young worker who came to Alberta in 2007 expecting a frontier and found one has children now. Those children are making different calculations. The frontier is closed. The mature industry that remains is not the same proposition. Some will stay and build in the niches that genuinely exist. Some will leave for places where the frontier is still open. The system will continue. Alberta will continue. But the specific version of Alberta that was supposed to be the permanent engine of Canadian prosperity, the province that would always regenerate because the oil would always be there, that province is already a different place than the one the story described. The oil is still there. The engine has been redesigned. And the redesign happened quietly, rationally, incentive by incentive, decision by decision, without a single villain and without a single moment of failure, which is why it is so difficult to look at directly and so easy to keep waiting for the reversal that the structure no longer supports. The extraction continues. The renewal is not coming. You are living inside the gap between those two facts, and so is everyone who bet their future on the assumption that one would always fund the other.